Hello, it's Caleb here from Remember the Wild. Today we're going to be delving into the world of nature photography, so prepare to get a tan, an adrenaline shot, and maybe a bit of malaria. Nature photography is one of the best ways of connecting with and interacting with the amazing natural world that we find around us if you know where to look. It's a way of enshrining a moment or creating an icon out of a natural wonder or an animal that you've been lucky enough to come across, not to mention a way of experiencing all the psychological benefits that come with being out in nature. The best thing about nature photography is that you can do it at any level, whether you're trying to photograph the fledgling behavior of a zitting cisticola, or if you're this guy, anybody can get something out of it. And in this video series, I'm going to be presumptuous enough to show you the basics on how. The most important part of nature photography is understanding how your camera actually works. One of the most difficult elements of shooting in nature is that you have almost no control over your conditions. You've got to figure all of it out in here. But how do you do that? How do you camera? Well, I might just have been contracted to answer that question in this video, so I'm glad I telepathically heard you ask it. So, onto the basics of how to use your camera. First, if you have an SLR or similar, I strongly encourage you to get out of that safety zone of just using auto settings and try to tackle that seemingly generationally out of your age range rugby player of manual settings. And the ball, of course, in this analogy is a better picture. So, yeah, see, it holds up. Using full manual exposure gives you access to all those strings that you need to pull to make that light really dance. We've darted into a different analogy now. However, if you're still learning to marionette your light and you'd prefer to tackle a slightly easier player and unite two frankly insoluble analogies in doing so, there are ways to do that. You can learn to use one setting at a time. So we're going to go through them just like that. There are three main factors that you need to understand before you can dance around that oncoming side. And they are shutter speed or exposure time, aperture, otherwise known as f-stop, and ISO, also known as ISO. Now, these are not scary. Let's meet them. Maybe that tackle is going to turn into a hug. So shutter speed is how long you expose your pixels to the light. The longer your shutter is open, the more light is allowed in. The longer your shutter speed or exposure time, the brighter your image will be. But there is a catch. You need to think of light as painting itself onto the sensor of your camera. So if you only expose your sensor for a very short amount of time, then the light will only make a very small dot of paint onto your camera's sensor. That means that your image will be very sharp, so the detail will be crisp. But in a lot of light conditions, 1/500th is not going to be enough of an exposure, so your image will not be very bright. However, if you expose for longer, such as 1/10 of a second, then the little paintbrushes will be able to apply much more light onto the sensor of your camera and your image will be very well lit. However, this is where the catch comes in. What happens if whatever is holding that brush moves while you are exposing the sensor? The light will be dragged across the sensor of your camera. In short, you get something called blur. So if your shutter speed is faster, then the light won't be coming in for as long, which means that it'll be frozen and there'll be less chance for blur. However, there won't be as much light, so the image will be darker. But if you expose for longer, then the image will be brighter with more chance of blur. That's shutter speed. Now we can talk about aperture. Now, aperture is basically just the size of the hole in the lens through which the light passes, which is why some, mostly me, have taken to calling it the light orifice. Now, an aperture of 1 is theoretically the largest hole size for an aperture. However, in commercially available lenses, it mostly goes down to about 1.2. The weird thing about aperture, though, is that it also affects something else about the image, something not altogether related to exposure, and that is depth of field. Take a look at this image. See how the background's blurred? That's because the image has a shallow depth of field. This comes from a wide aperture or an enlarged light orifice. Now look at this image. More of the background is now in focus. The depth of field is now deep enough to see the background in some detail. This comes from a small hole or aperture, which comes from a higher number. Now, aperture is also called f-stop. Now, this is just a synonym, it's nothing to be scared of. You might say you have a f-stop or an aperture of 2. Now, this will give you a kiddie pool shallow depth of field, and the image will be very well lit. Alternatively, you might have something like a f-stop of 18. Now, this will be a much darker image, but the depth of field will be so deep, it might as well be a psalm. Now, in my opinion, aperture is the tricky one. So if you're even vaguely following on still, then you'll understand the rest, no problem. Finally, we have ISO. Now, despite the intimidating fact that it's an acronym, you might actually find that this is one of the most familiar concepts. ISO is basically just the same as the brightness setting on an Instagram or computer editing software. So if you really pump the ISO, so to speak, then you will increase the brightness, but at the expense of image quality. But what do I mean by image quality? Well, it has to do with how pure or rich the colors are and how precise the details are in the image. Basically, with very high ISO settings, your image will become what is known as grainy. You can see it here in these examples. It basically looks like what you see when you close your eyes and rub them really hard, only superimposed over the whole image. Gross! Somebody smeared the inside of an eyelid all over your image. That's disgusting. That's why you got to take care of your ISO. So, like when you edit brightness digitally on a phone or a computer, a high ISO or brightness will improve the image to a point, and then beyond that, quality will begin to decrease. And that's it. So, you have shutter speed, which is how long the light is allowed in for, aperture, which is how large the hole is allowed to be, and ISO, which is the basic in-camera brightness setting. Simple. So you can make the camera choose just one of these for you to use manually while the other two remain on automatic, and then you can bump it up to using 2 manually until you're using all 3. You'll find that some conditions benefit from using one over the other, but using all 3 together gives you a much bigger range of possibilities. I'm going to leave it there for today. That's a lot of info. So just remember that triple axis of exposure. Exposure time, aperture, and ISO. Nature photography is an incredible way of engaging with the nature around you. So get out there, make mistakes, learn that axis, and enjoy yourself. I've been Caleb from Remember the Wild. Stay tuned for more. That's been How to Camera.